It's almost Rosh Hashanah. Happy New Year. There you go.
So welcome, everybody. I'm just starting the recording, and we're live on Facebook as well. We're here at a live virtual Mezuzah workshop and presentation. The main part will be a presentation with a little bit of those that picked up your kit. You'll be able to practice your quill, like you'll feel like a founding father or a scribe with a quill and ink. And you can write some Hebrew letters, some Torah letters. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Rochester's own Sofer Scribe Rabbi Dov Chastain.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you for having me. For anybody that doesn't have the kit also, I'm going to do a lot of show and tell on my end as well, so you can see everything. The Rabbi already pointed out that I learned to be a Sofer, I learned to be a scribe in Eretz Yisrael. One of the places that I lived for 8 years before I moved here was Israel. And then I lived in Portland, Oregon for a little while. When I became a Sofer in Eretz Yisrael, it was during the years that I was learning there, and it was really something that I did not imagine I was going to use as much as I am. I really did it as more of a hobby. I was a bit of an artist when I was growing up, and I wanted a way to be able to use that artistic outlet when I was in Israel. So I enrolled in a course in what they call Ksivas Ha'osios, writing the letters of what we call Ksava Shuris, which is the writing form that we find in Sefer Torahs and Megillahs and Mezuzahs and Tefillin. And I really enjoyed it very much and practiced real hard. But I learned the halachos, I learned the laws, and I mostly learned a text called Mishnah Sofrim, which literally is the teaching of scribes, which was written by the Chafetz Chaim, who passed away in 1933. He was one of the great leaders of the generation before the Holocaust. And, I put it in my pocket, and it was definitely interesting. And then I moved to Portland, Oregon. And Portland, Oregon, as you may have guessed, did not have any type of sofer there. And I made the mistake of one day bringing my Megillah that I was working on. I was working on a Megillah Esther. I brought it to the Kollel, and I started working on it. And then all the rabbis in the Kollel were like, "Oh, you're a sofer?" I was like, up a little bit. And they, they're like, "Oh, we have plenty of Sifrei Torah and plenty of mezuzahs that need checking and fixing. So if you're up for it." So, I've never actually written a Sefer Torah in its entirety, but I think I've worked now on 15 or 16 Sifrei Torah, and I've checked several hundred mezuzahs at this point, which is not really what I didn't expect that I would do it. I really, was going to write a Megillah, and it was going to be a nice little hobby. But, I've used it a lot more in Portland and a lot more in Rochester. It's not my main job. My main job is I'm the assistant principal of Derech HaTorah of Rochester and a Judaic studies teacher there. But it's something that I can do that helps out the community, and I'm really happy to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. Here's my screen, and I'm going to pull up, there's my email. I'm going to pull up the presentation that I have. We'll start off with a little sound check. You'll give me a thumbs up if you hear it. Ooh, hold on. Share computer sound. This is going to make it easier for you to hear that. From beginning, let's give it a shot. Thumbs up if you hear it. Ooh, it might be really loud. Thumbs up. I'm looking through the audience. Who got that THX joke? Anybody? Oh, Sue raised her hand. Hold on, I'm going to Sue's hand. Does that mean you're raising your hand to tell me that you hear good? That's good. If you have a question though, you can write it in the chat and I'll see it. That way, if you have any questions, you can ask me. And I don't think I have to ask you. I do when I teach at Derech HaTorah, but don't use the annotate button. I don't think I really have to ask this crowd to do that because I think you guys are a little older than my students. All right. So we're going to get started. There's really two parts of this presentation. The first one is going over all of the tools and utensils and supplies that a sofer needs, because it does get a little bit complicated, and I want you to see what goes into it. And the second part is really a buyer's guide for mezuzahs, because there are plenty of things that I bet you did think of, but there's also plenty that people don't think of when they're buying a mezuzah. So I want to go through all of that with you. And we're going to jump right in right now. Here we go. All right. I also want to dedicate this class that it should serve as a zchus, as a merit for the Refuah Shlema of Rebbetzin Chaya Necha Kalimnik. and she should have a refuah shlema, God willing. We're going to start by speaking about necessary safras supplies. And some of them you have. The first one's called a kulmus. And I'll actually take out my favorite kulmus here. I've got my big box of supplies here. I've got the one that I've been using to write my Megillah. And this little guy started off as a turkey feather once upon a time. And when he came into my life, he had all his feathers on him. But it's actually very easy to take them off. You can really grab them straight from the side and pull straight down. They come right off. It's much easier to write if you take them off. Some people like to be fancy. They like to leave some frilly feather on there. It's kind of difficult to work with, because then you're combating feather all the time as you try to work. So the first thing I always do is peel those straight off, and I'm going to show you the process that I take for fashioning this all the way from a feather into being a very well-used quill at this point. You can see him up close and personal. There he is. He's got a lot of ink still in him, although it's dry and it is clean as far as what I need it to be able to continue to write. And he's sharp. I sharpen it every once in a while. All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what makes a good kulmus. I'm going to quote for you, first of all, the Kesses HaSofer, which literally means the inkwell of the scribe. It is a very fundamental and important work for any sofer, for any scribe. It was written by Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried. Rabbi Shlomo Gansfried is famous for writing the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the abbreviated code of Jewish law, but his magnum opus was really more the Kesses HaSofer. It's used very widely by anybody who is a scribe. And he speaks about what it takes to make a kulmus. And I gave you the exact quote from where we're going to be. It's in chapter 3, halacha 6. He says, on every occasion, one must check that the kulmus is well formed. And what I do after I go through about a column of Megillah, which is the main thing that I work on, I'll take a razor and I'll make sure that it's nice and sharp. I actually have medical scalpels here that I use, and I will make sure that it's nice and sharp on the tip, because there are a lot of times where I need that tip. If I am making a tag, a little crown on top of one of the letters, some of the letters have crowns, or a coats, a thorn. I really need that to be nice and sharp to be able to do it. And so I am making sure that it's shaped well. You don't have to do it that often, but like I said, after I get through about a column, I'm making sure to keep it nice and sharp. Some say that you can only write with a quill made from a reed and not from a feather. A lot of Sephardic scribes actually write with a reed even today. The main utensil used by Ashkenazim is a feather. But like he says here, Rabbi Gansfried was from Hungary, so he's going with Ashkenazi customs. He says we don't adhere to this custom. Rather, we write with a feather. And I'll tell you, practically, it's usually a turkey feather, which I mentioned down here at the bottom. Even a quill made of iron, and this is a very strange ruling, as I point out, as it's not done at all today. And using metal is actually a bit of a problem, according to some halachic commentaries, because you're not supposed to use something that could be used in warfare. Metal, iron, is used to make swords. You're not supposed to use that in writing something like a Sefer Torah. We don't use something that cuts short life to write something that's supposed to elongate life, like our relationship with God that we get through the Torah. But Rashi mentions that it was in practice at some point, but it has been a very long time since Sofrim, since scribes have been doing that. And he points out here there's a doubt as whether it's permissible to write with a feather from a non-kosher bird. As I mentioned here, practically at the bottom, many Sephardi scribes will use a reed, and Ashkenazi scribes will use a feather. You will find some Ashkenazi scribes, if they're not really confident in their ability. I shouldn't say that. I don't want to mock anybody. If some will use this plastic tip. If you can see over here on the far right, this is added on to a feather, but the tip itself is actually plastic, which is okay to use. But certainly myself, I like to try to use a feather. Aside from the fact that it feels more authentic, it also is more lechatchila, it's best case scenario, rather than using plastic, which, like I said, it's a little bit more if you have difficulty with the feathers, people move to plastic. And we'll talk a little bit about making the kulmus. So the first thing that you need is a number 11 and a number 15 scalpel blade. And number 11 is really the one you start with, because when this thing comes as a complete feather, you have to pop off the tip. And I've experimented with a lot of different things. I've used, I'll show you what I've used here. and I learned not to do it. These little, I've used these guys before, and they're very strong scissors. But when you do that, you pulverize the feather a little bit, and it cracks it. It's not so good. The number 11 blade is a great implement. You do have to proceed with caution because you could, God forbid, cut yourself, but you are going to pop the top of that feather right off. And once you do, when you look inside it, you'll find that there are a lot, I don't think it's cartilage per se, but there's a lot of material inside these feathers. And it's I wonder if I have a picture in here of what that looks like exactly. I could also cut open a feather for you. I do have some uncut feathers. But, oh, somebody raised their hand in the chat. Ooh. Oh, it's been, okay, yeah. We'll get there. Yeah, so I fashioned the quills using those blades. The number 15 blade is the one that I actually used to make the tip to my specifications. We'll keep going here. Here we go. And I'll go quickly through what we need to do to make a kulmus, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on the writing aspect. So, of course, you remove the barbs, and that's what you have after you're done with it. And then you start scraping it off because you want it to be smooth. You want to scrape off any protrusions because you have to use it as a writing implement, and protrusions will hurt your hand. And then you slice off the top. And then this is what I was talking about, having to clean it out. You'll find that material there inside it, and you have to clear it out to be able to have the ink flow work well for you. And then you start shaping it. I oftentimes use the rounded blade to do that. I find that it gives me more. And then you give a slit down the middle to be able to have it act as a pen. You can see, I'm not sure if you could see, but mine's slit down the middle there. And then you're going to want to cut it on an angle. That also aids in the flow of the ink out of the kulmus, out of the quill. And over there I have a couple of quills that are ready to work with. And over here, this is actually something that's very interesting. Most letters that you're going to write are 3 kulmus widths high. And I called it over here a nib, but it means the size of the end of the kulmus. Most letters that you're going to write are really a box of 3 by 3. You have some letters that are longer, but most letters are a 3 by 3 box. And whenever you're going to start writing, you want to make this little stair-step pattern that he made over here to be able to figure out how big your letters should be. In fact, I show it over here. The quill has to be 1/6 the thickness of the gaps of the lines, which we're going to talk, it says they're shirtut. It's actually sirtut with a sin, not with a shin. So that the Hebrew character is usually 3 kulmusim, 3 nib widths tall, with the obvious exceptions where you have a very tall letter that descends further down, which is why you need to have space of 6, because your biggest letters are only 6 tall. So as long as you have a kulmus that matches the sirtut, the guidelines of what you're writing, you're going to be okay. So when I cut my quill, I take a look in front of me. Let's say I have parchment, and I'll pull out some parchment right now that I've been working with. I'll pull out a Megillah. Give me one moment as I pull it out here. And when I'm taking a look at my Megillah, here's my Megillah. Let's see if I can find. I wonder if this will show up well on camera or not. It's possible that it won't. Yeah, I'm not sure how well the guidelines will show up on here. So I also have slides, though, that show it. When I have a Megillah, so this is how wide my cloth is. And what I have to do is I have to take the kulmus, I have to take the quill that I've made and make sure that the size of the width of my quill can fit 6 lines within that space. Otherwise, my kulmus will be too big, and it won't be able to write that particular scroll that I'm working on. So that's something that's very important. We write with an ink called DO, and I believe you got some ink from the rabbi today. I'll show you the ink that I use over here. I have ink that looks just like that for the most part. Here's my ink that I have with me. This is called DO, and they also call it Nahari. And then I also have something called midalel. Midalel is thinner, and we'll talk about when you need thinner. It all really depends on the climate. Believe it or not, the climate is going to affect a lot how you write. If it's drier outside, you're going to need to add thinner. If it's more humid outside, you're going to need to let it get a little more dry. Maybe open the cap of your inkwell, which I have one of these as well. This is the inkwell that I use when I write. So I'm opening this cap and dipping my quill in there. So it definitely is affected by the climate, and I've seen it a lot. When I used to live in Portland, it would get really thick and dry really quickly, and I would have to add midalel. I don't have to do that so much in this climate. Somebody just asked, Maurice just asked, can you use a kulmus that is narrower for the crowns and the points of the letters? Yes, you can. If you want to use a detailed kulmus to be able to do the more detailed work, like you said, the crowns and the kotsim, the tips, you can definitely pull out another one. And I've done that before to be able to fill in that more detailed work. I like to keep my main kulmus that I'm using nice and sharp so that if I want to do that, I have the ability with that particular kulmus. But yes, you could do that. Let me keep going here. Here we go. We're going to talk a little bit about this DO, about this ink. And we're going to first quote that Kesses HaSofer, who's the individual we quoted before, the rabbi we quoted before, Rabbi Shlomo Ganstried, who says that it's a halacha that we learn all the way back from Moshe at Sinai, that a Torah scroll has to be written with DO. And we're going to talk about what components make up DO. Now quoting the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, he says that by tefillin, they should be written with black ink, and this is true for other Sifrei Kodesh, other holy books as well. If one wrote even one letter with other colors or with gold, they would be invalid. So it's got to be a black ink. Only black ink is acceptable. Ink of any other color is not kosher for Sifrei Kodesh, for holy scrolls. In ancient times, the ink used for writing a Torah scroll was obtained by boiling oils, tar, and wax, and collecting the vapors. Afterwards, the mixture would be combined with tree sap and honey, and then dried out and stored. And before its use, it would be mixed with gallnut juice. Nowadays, Sofrim prepare ink using gallnut juice and gum, and the black color is achieved by adding various tints. And the ink that I use, which I showed you over here, and you also saw in that previous picture, that's the midalel, actually, that's the thinner. This is the main ink that I use. So the ink I use is made from gum arabic, which serves as the bonding agent. It makes it thick enough and makes it go on to the cloth well, which we're going to talk about cloth, that's the parchment. Tannic acid from the gallnut, and ferrous sulfate or copper sulfate. And those two chemicals cause the ink to turn black. And the ink must be pitch black. And over the years after you've written a sefer, a scroll, after the years, the ink might turn a reddish or rusty color. That's because of the copper sulfate in there. If that happens after many years, then many halakhic authorities consider it still kosher. It would have to get to a very faded color before you would actually have trouble with it. So if you're looking at a Sefer Torah that the ink looks a dark brown and it has faded over the years, you're still kosher. If you start getting into a light brown, then you really have to make sure to show it to a posek, a halakhic decider, to make sure that your Sefer Torah is still kosher. I actually worked on a Sefer Torah that was saved from the Holocaust and donated to my school, and there definitely were sections in there that had gotten to the point where I needed to go strengthen them because they had already faded to the point where they were a light brown. So I went in there and went over those sections. Let's keep going here. We'll talk about two types of DO. I mentioned them both briefly, but I'll explain them over here. We have our main DO, our main ink over here, and our ink has a hechsher on it, by the way, because just like you want your food to have a hechsher, a kosher symbol, you want to make sure that your ink, even more so, it's being used for, holy scrolls like a Sefer Torah, that you need to have a hechsher on there. And like I mentioned, in the winter, the ink could be runny, so a sofer will leave the cap off to let it thicken a little bit. While in the summer, he might add water or other chemicals. The only thing that I've added personally is this midalel. Midalel literally means thinner, and that was also created by a sofer and has a hechsher on it. Overwatering it will make the ink turn gray, and then that won't be kosher. So the only things that I've used are midalel, which is that thinning agent, and sometimes I've left the cap off to let it get a little thicker by evaporating out some of the water content. Now we'll talk a little bit, come back. There we go. We'll talk about the parchment. There's really 3 levels of parchment. After you get an animal hide, there is something called gvil. That is the layer furthest out towards the hair. There's something called klaf. That's the inner layer, the middle layer. And then something called duxustus, which is the layer that's actually closest to the flesh. The top layer, just below the hair, can be used for Sifrei Torah. A Torah can be written on that layer or on the middle layer called klaf. And tefillin and mezuzahs are written exclusively on the klaf. That's the middle the middle level of the hide. And the use of gevil is not very common today. Duxustus can't be used for anything. And most klaf that we have today is actually from a shalil, which is an embryo. It's made from the hides of calves, and it makes the finest, softest klaf. So we're usually using that middle layer, that klaf, when we are writing anything nowadays, whether it's a Torah, a Megillah, a Mezuzah, we're using, or tefillin, we're using that middle layer. I'll talk a little bit about the process of working the hide to be able to get it to the point where you can write on it. So they're soaked in water, and they're prepared for something called tanning. You've probably been to a leather tannery before. The first leather tannery I was actually ever at was with my father in Atlanta, Georgia, to pick out a leather belt. And then we got cool stamps that we could actually stamp into the leather. That's something I did years ago with my father. That was the first time I went to a leather tannery. The leather tannery for making cloth is a little bit different. They're tanned in lime wash for a number of days until the hairs all fall off. Then they're hung to dry, re-soaked and stretched on a wooden frame. And at this point, they're sanded down so that they're very smooth. And you want to have smooth cloth. Otherwise, if you have bumpy cloth, it's very difficult to write on it, and your kulmus will get snagged on the bumps. And I've had cloth that has been better and cloth that's been worse. If it's too smooth, your ink will be runny. And if it's too bumpy, you'll get caught on it and there'll be snags and the writing won't look very smooth. So there's this just right place in cloth that you're looking for. And it happens to be for cloth that I've actually bought, I have made sure to feel it. I bought a Megillah cloth. I'm writing a Megillah Esther. I bought that in Israel. And I made sure for all of the 26 columns of it that I purchased that I felt those columns to make sure that it was to my liking, because I was going to have to write on them. And, I wanted to make sure it's something that I felt comfortable with, because if not, you'll have a lot of trouble writing. Let's keep going. The parchment has to be made Lishma. That means for the sake of the mitzvah, with specific intention for the holiness of whatever it is that is going to be written on it, a Torah, a tefillin, or a mezuzah, or a Megillah. This process is done by an observant Jew, and when they are making the cloth, they express verbally l'shem kedushas sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzah. This is for the sake of the sanctity of a Torah scroll, of tefillin, of phylacteries, or of mezuzah. They say that at the outset of the tanning process. And also, that's something I do whenever I sit down to write. If I'm about to sit down and write my Megillah, I have to say l'shem kedushas Megillah, and before I start writing. You have to do it with specific intent for the sanctity of the scroll that you are creating. And it gets even more important when you're dealing with a mezuzah, and I'll tell you why. The first thing that a sofer is ever going to write is going to be a Megillah. The reason is because a Megillah has the least halachos, the least laws, because Hashem's name is not present in the Megillah. Hashem is hidden in the story of the Megillah. But that also makes it much easier to write, because once you start having Hashem's name, there are a lot more halachos of what you have to do to sanctify a scroll that has Hashem's name, and it also gets a lot more technical about when you can erase something. When you're writing a mezuzah, or you're writing tefillin, they have to be written in order. And if you write Hashem's name and there's a mistake before Hashem's name, you can't erase Hashem's name, so you can't erase back to that mistake. So mezuzahs and tefillin are very difficult to fix. I'll speak about that a little bit more when I get into mezuzahs. But there's a lot of halachos that apply by them, which is why many scribes will start off with the Megillah, because it's a lot easier to write. We're going to talk about sirtut for a second, which are those guidelines. So I'm going to quote the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, who says that a mezuzah and this is applicable. I brought it from the halachos of mezuzah, from the laws of mezuzah, but it's applicable to other Sifrei Kodesh, other holy scrolls, that a mezuzah needs sirtut, it needs guidelines. And if one wrote it without these guidelines, it's invalid. So we need to have these guidelines scratched in, and it needs to go straight across, so you have horizontal lines going across your mezuzah or your other holy scroll. And it also practically makes it way easier. Here he is scratching in those sirtut. In order to write on the cloth, straight lines, sirtut have to be manually scored with an awl along where the letters are going to be written. In addition, they also score guidelines on the right and left margins. It is not as hard as it looks. He's doing that with a ruler and going line by line. The machines that I've actually seen present in the leather tanneries and places where they're making cloth, they have a much larger scratching machine that scratches across several lines in one shot, and they can go across one column in one shot and make sirtut, make guidelines for the whole thing. So it's not quite as tedious as it looks in this picture. They can go straight across and do however many lines they need to do for whatever section. So it's not as hard as this picture makes it seem. Let's keep going. We'll talk a little bit about gidin. Gidin are sinews. Whenever you're going to have a scroll that needs to be sewn up, it has to be sewn up with these sinews. I actually have the same sinews from that very picture right here, and I've used them before. I actually did some sewing on one of the Sifrei Torah of the Torahs at Chabad of Rochester on Winton. I sewed up a sefer for Rabbi Muchkin asked me to help him with that. And I've also sewn up a good few things in Rochester. I've sewn up a scroll of one of the prophets over at Yeshiva, as well as a Torah over there. And these gidin are really sinews, and it's strings made out of sinews. It's from the calf area of a cow or a bull. They're removed, they're dried, and then when you crack this sinew open, there are many, many threads inside. And those threads are pulled off and twined together by hand with an adhesive to form an extremely long strip. And then they're twined to form a long stretch of gid, of sinew, and wrapped up as a ball or around a piece of plastic like I have for easy unraveling. And some opinions require this sinew, this gid, to be made lishma as well, for the sake of the mitzvah of whatever scroll it's going to be used for. Of Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Megillos. It doesn't have to be used for a mezuzah. A mezuzah is not sewn up in any places. That can be done by any Torah observant adult, male or female. And some uses of gidin are to sew together Sifrei Torah. That's what binds the Torah together at all of the different breaks in the columns. Well, there could be several columns on one urea. A urea means a piece of parchment. So an amud is the name for a column, and a urea is the name for a whole piece of parchment. So there are several amudim, several columns on every big piece of parchment. Megillos are also like that, and works of the Sifrei Nach, the prophets. If a person wants to read a haftarah in davening after the Torah service, some people use actual scrolls for those as well. Those are also sewn together. And to close the batim of tefillin, those are the tefillin boxes. They're sewn together with these gidin as well. And if we give another class on tefillin, I can teach you even more about that. Let's keep going. All right, now we're going to get into the buyer's guide for a mezuzah. This is very important for any consumer, for any Jewish person to know when they're purchasing a mezuzah. We're going to go through the main things. The first thing, of course, you need to know is that it's got to be written with DO. And you'll be able to tell DO from a photocopy because DO pops off the page a little bit. You can see in that picture that I have there, DO, you can feel it. It's not just a photocopy onto a piece of paper. It protrudes off the piece of paper a little bit. So that is one thing. When I open up a mezuzah, that's one of the first things I'm looking for, to make sure that it pops off the page a little bit. And unfortunately, there are some individuals that sell photocopies of mezuzahs to unsuspecting customers. I've seen it many times in my career where I pull out a mezuzah and lo and behold, that's a photocopy. It's important to realize it is thick, it protrudes from the page. That'll help you avoid fraud. I've seen it. This one over here on the right is real. This one over here is a straight up photocopy. It's nice and bright and white, and it doesn't protrude off the page. And I've seen it plenty of times in my career where unsuspecting customers have bought a photocopy, and that is no good. All right, we'll move to the next one here. In addition, you can tell a photocopy from a real mezuzah by the material it's written on. A mezuzah can only be written on parchment, on cloth, that was processed l'shem mitzvah for the sake of the mitzvah of making a mezuzah. It's not paper. Parchment will often be thicker than paper. It'll also have a smooth side and a fuzzy side. We write on that fuzzier side so that the DO, the ink, will adhere well. And then on the back of it will be more smooth. It'll be the smooth leather side. You'll also be able, though, to use that knowledge to tell if what you have is actually cloth, if it's parchment, or if it is a piece of paper. Okay. The next thing is going to be those sirtut lines that I mentioned. If you ever have a authentic real mezuzah, that's going to have those lines scored across it. You'll be able to tell that it's a real mezuzah. A photocopy will not have sirtut unless they're a really good charlatan, but you're not usually going to see sirtut on a photocopy. That's the guidelines. And though it should be self-evident, the second most common issue that I've actually had checking mezuzahs is that the purchaser bought a case with no scroll in it and thought that he or she was buying a scroll as well. They get sold a mezuzah, they buy a very pretty, beautiful case, and they put it up on their doorpost, and then a few years later, they bring it to Rabbi Chastain to check it, and there is no mezuzah in there when I open it up, and I tell them, you've bought a beautiful case, but the case is missing the most important part, and that is the panemius, the inside of it is missing. The outside is there and it's a nice show, but you need to have that scroll on the inside. That's the whole point. So I've found that plenty of times where people have brought me a mezuzah and there was no mezuzah in there. Okay, although other Sifrei Kodesh can be made of more than one piece of parchment sewn together, a mezuzah, not only when you get a mezuzah is it not, but it also makes a problem if it is. It's got to be one piece of parchment with 22 lines. I have with me right now, let's see, I put it on the table here. Here we go. This is actually my template that I use when I am checking mezuzahs. It's 22 lines, it's one piece of parchment. So if anybody actually gave me mezuzahs to check, I will lay out that mezuzah on top of this and go line by line, checking it against my template to make sure that everything is done correctly. There are also scanner apps that can be used to check it against software. I have found that as helpful as those are, there are times that it misses things that a human eye that is very scrupulous will catch, believe it or not. Keep going here. All right, this is what the outside of a mezuzah scroll is going to look like. It's going to have the name of Hashem, Shin Daled Yud, which we pronounce as Shakai because we're not davening right now, so we're not going to pronounce it. That alludes to Hashem being all-powerful and having the power to do whatever he wants. That's written on the outside of the mezuzah. It's written in, if you flip the mezuzah over, that's the blank space between the two paragraphs of Shema and the Haya'im Shemoah. They'll have that word will fit in right there. And above on the top here, written upside down, is a Kabbalistic list of 3 words. It's Kuzu, Muchkuz Kuzu, which is Hashem Elokeinu Hashem. It's written exactly opposite the words Hashem Elokeinu Hashem in the word Shema Yisrael, in the sentence Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So opposite the words Hashem Elokeinu Hashem, this will be written upside down in, it's not Atbash, it's another form of Kabbalistic references to the letters in Hebrew, and it stands for Hashem Elokeinu Hashem. And you're also going to see that if it was written by a good sofer, it is rolled from the end of the mezuzah towards where it says Shema Yisrael, as you could see over here, and how it is rolled. And it'll have that Shin Daled Yud on the outside, and you'll be able to see that when you put it into the case. Give me one second. I think there was one last thing on the bottom of that I wanted to show you. It's just getting blocked here. Yeah, oh, that's just the same letters that are written there. There, I put it for you, not upside down. But when you actually look at the mezuzah, it is upside down. Let's keep going. So that'll be on the outside. That's what you're looking for on the outside of any authentic mezuzah. Let's speak about forming the letters for a moment. If you have over here, you can see that ayin is touching that sin. The letters can't be touching like that. If it's a hairline touch, it can be fixed by a sofer. If it's more letters blended together, then you may not be able to fix it, because like I said, in a mezuzah, you have a big problem. If you have to erase, you can't erase the name of Hashem, and it has to be written in order. So if I wanted to fix a mezuzah, I have to start erasing from the end of the mezuzah back towards the beginning. And if the mistake is, if I have to pass a name of Hashem to get to that mistake, then I can't do it, because I can't erase the name of Hashem. So if you have a hairline touch, it's worst case scenario still kosher. And since that's true, you can go in there and fix it. But if it was a letter that was really blended together, it's time to get a new mezuzah. And that sofer should have been a little bit more careful, and or it could be that it was weather damage that did that. The next thing I want to mention is that there are several letters that have crowns on them, and they should have crowns on them. If they don't, you're still kosher, but it's more of a worst case scenario, not a best case scenario. Those letters are shin or sin, ayin, tes, nun, zayin, gimel, sadi, and sadi sofit. Those are the letters that will have those crowns. And the crowns will have, it's a 3-part crown, with the middle being the longest, then the right side, and then the left side. And down here also you can see the letter yud. And the letter yud has what we call kotzim, they're thorns. And it's got a thorn on the left side, on the top and bottom. And the right side also has to extend down into a sharp point as well. And that's what a yud needs to look like. There are some that make the top coats, the top thorn on a yud into a tag. So they'll have a little ball on the top instead of just having it as a protrusion. That's actually how I was taught to write, with it being a tag, a crown, rather than just a protrusion at the top. You also are not supposed to write on a cloth that has holes. There is a halacha, there's a law that whatever you're writing has to be surrounded by cloth. It has to be surrounded by parchment on all sides. So that's actually a halacha known as mukaf gvil. It has to be surrounded by parchment. So if there's a hole, like in my dalid over here, where that dalid, it happens to be, it's actually long enough, even with the end of that dalid ripped off of it, it would still be long enough to be a kosher dalid. However, it dead ends into a hole, so it's not completely surrounded by parchment. It would make it non-kosher. However, if I did have like a little pinhole in the middle of the dalid, somewhere smack dab in the middle, that could still be kosher. But over here, the way this dead ends into a hole, then the letter is not surrounded by parchment. It makes it non-kosher. And of course, a letter can't be cut in half. So you can see over here, this vav, this zayin, and this chaf sofit are cut in half in a place where it is now invalid. And what I just mentioned before, if it is cut in a place where the remainder of the letter is big enough for it to be kosher on its own right, then it's okay. So if, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? Raise your hand if you can see where my cursor is. If this vav was cut right here where my cursor is, it would still be big enough to be a vav. And you could, you don't have to care about the little bit of the vav that's on the bottom that's cut off. But up here, where it's cut, it turns it into a yud, and we have a problem. So all 3 of these letters that are cut are a problem. And the cut is big enough that it would invalidate the mezuzah. However, if the cut was very, very small, if it was a hairline fracture, it's still worst case scenario kosher, and a scribe would be able to fix it and fill it in. So we spoke a little bit before about fading letters. So this word in the middle here has faded to a light enough brown, although you can't tell it's brown from here, it looks gray. But it's faded enough where we'd have a problem. We would have to go in, like in this picture on the far left, and fill that back in. If that happened in a mezuzah, that could be problematic. You would need to replace that mezuzah because, like I said, that word is like it doesn't exist if it got that faded. And therefore, since the mezuzah has to be written in order, you'd have a problem. If that happened in a Sefer Torah, in a Torah scroll, you could go in there and fix it, because there is no such law like that with a Torah or with a Megillah. It only exists with a mezuzah and with tefillin. All right, here's my big 5 points that I want to leave you with, and I want you to think about these things every time you purchase a mezuzah. Get your mezuzah from a Yirei Shemayim, a God-fearing person. There are several halachos, several laws with regards to mezuzah that a buyer would never know if they were broken. For example, the need to write the mezuzah in order. Maybe it was written out of order and you wouldn't know. No one's able to check that. That I can't check. So you want to have a God-fearing person who's going to make sure that gets taken care of. Rebecca, can you let the puppy dog outside? Thank you. All right, number 2, make sure your mezuzahs are in weatherproof cases if they're going to be outside, if they're going to be on a front door, a back door, anywhere that's not inside your house. It's got to be a weatherproof case. Be especially careful with mezuzahs that are placed on doors outside. I've seen plenty of times where there was weather damage on a mezuzah and it wasn't savable. And that was because it was on an outer door and it was not in a weatherproof case. Number 3, check your mezuzahs once every 3.5 years. The wording of the Shulchan Aruch of the Code of Jewish Law is twice in 7 years. That breaks down to once in every 3.5. Size matters. It's better to get a mezuzah with a larger print. It's very difficult to write a small mezuzah, and it's very difficult to write it nicely. And it'll be more likely to be puzzle invalid if it's written in very small ksav, very small writing. Now, it does show that your sofer is, a mumcha. He's amazing if he can write it that small, but it's also really hard to do, and it's more prone to mistakes when you have to get really small. Always check the words. This is the last one, number 5. Check the words that appear multiple times in the mezuzah with different spellings. These words are mezuzos, al mezuzos beisecha, on the doorposts of your house. It shows up a couple of times. It's spelled differently, and I've seen people make that mistake and spell it the same way twice. Totafos is in there twice, and it's spelled differently each time. Also, check the words yadecha versus yedchem and einecha versus einechem. For some reason, scribes mess those up. So I check those a lot, and that's where I find a lot of mistakes. These are likely spots for mistakes. Those are your big 5 of where I find issues. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed. And now I'm going to turn this presentation over to Rabbi Hein, who's going to speak with you about why we did this presentation this time of year, and also give you the opportunity to write a little bit with your own Safra supplies. Rabbi, take it away.
Thank you very much. If you could just unshare your screen for a moment.
I will. I have stopped sharing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. A very informative presentation. I learned a lot. A regular rabbi does not get the training to be a sofer, and as Rabbi Chastain said, it's a specialty. The reason why we did this right now, everything is very timely. Divine providence makes everything in the right time. We just entered the Hebrew month of Elul, the last month of the Jewish year, and the month getting ready for Rosh Hashanah. While Rabbi Chastain mentioned that the basic requirement is to check mezuzahs every 3.5 years, that's a basic requirement. It's been suggested by some rabbis, including the Rebbe, that because of the way when that law existed, when it was written, which was thousands, hundreds of years ago, and it's quoting from a Gemara, a Talmud, which is thousands of years ago, the tanning process and the way they would tan the hides is a little different. And the bottom line is practically, as Rabbi Chastain said, because of waterproof issues and whatnot, there's many more things that can go wrong with a mezuzah today than many years ago. Therefore, although it's not required, it's definitely a great, 3.5 years is required. If you could do it every year, particularly getting ready in this month for Rosh Hashanah, it's a special extra. But if you haven't done it in a while, this is a great time. We're getting ready for Rosh Hashanah, and we should check our mezuzahs on our doors. If we don't have mezuzahs on all our doors, all bedroom or room doors in the house, it's a good idea to add some now.
That's very important. That's another thing that I find. Sometimes people are asking me, I want you to check my mezuzah as an added, security for my family. And I tell them, you're a mezuzah? You need mezuzahs on all your doorposts. And then I tell them, even a bigger safeguard for your family would be to make sure you have a mezuzah on every door. And I can also help people determine if it's a doorway that requires a mezuzah or not.
Right. Not every doorway requires a mezuzah. So it's actually interesting. There's many stories where people had health issues or other problems, and they checked their mezuzahs, and the mezuzah had a psul, something that made it invalid, whether it was not kosher to begin with or it was it became unkosher over time, and they fixed it, and many times that helped bring extra healing or protection. It's brought down that the mezuzah is something that protects the door, although we don't do it only because of, we don't do the mezuzah because of, it's for protection. We do it because it's a mitzvah. It's a way a Jew connects their home and their life to Hashem. But there is a certain benefit to the mezuzah that it does protect the inhabitants of the home. We even had a story recently in Rochester. There was a baby that was born with a heart problem. I think Rabbi Chastain was the scribe, and he found a problem with one of the words. You can elaborate on it. Real life story. These are.
Wow, I didn't know that story was going around. Where did you hear it? You don't have to tell me.
What's that?
You are correct. That is correct. There was a Baruch Hashem. I think that baby is home and doing all right. Bezras Hashem, they should continue to have a refuah shlema. They should have a complete recovery. You are correct.
So it's a special thing. It's something that gives us protection. It's not like a quid pro quo, like God, I'll do a mezuzah and you protect me. It's more like this is a spiritual armor for us. The Rebbe actually compared it to the idea of wearing a helmet. That it's not that a person who does a mezuzah deserves punishment. It's just a mezuzah, spirituality is real, God is real, and a mezuzah enables, activates around our home more mezuzah, more of a kosher mezuzah brings that blessing and that protection. So we're going to do a little bit. If those of you that have the kits, you can, we're not going to take too much time now. It's pretty self-explanatory. You have a sheet that has all the letters in the Ksav Ashuris, the scribal way of writing, and it has a do-it-yourself step-by-step. Practice a few letters, and then there's a piece of a small scrap of parchment, so you just get a feel for it. You can try writing your name in it. So I don't think it's something that we can do live on Zoom, but you have a quill, you have some ink, you have the how-to guide to write the letters, at least at a very amateur level, at a very basic level, and practice a little bit, and then see if you can write your name on the screen.
And you want to make sure when you're writing, it's not like writing with a pen. It's more dragging. You drag across to make the letters, and then if there are things that require a tag, one of those crowns, then you use the tip of it to try. That's a little bit more like a pen. But most things within Safras is dragging across as opposed to penmanship. So it's a little bit more like calligraphy. So it takes a little time to get a hang of it. Believe it or not, I'm actually going to be teaching a special in Derech HaTorah to some of the middle school boys on how to do this. So it's going to be fun. But yeah, it's more of a dragging motion. So that's a little bit of a tip from a sofer.
I'd like to share my screen for a moment.
Yeah. Just go to that. There you go. You got it.
Video. There's Chabad headquarters made a little video for this time of year, particularly in the coronavirus era that we live in. And here's a very short little video about the protection of mezuzah.
Just a little dramatic video. I don't know
Yeah, I see there's a question that came from Gennady Maruchnik. Is it okay if I address it?
Absolutely.
So Gennady asked, what if a person has old antique mezuzot and tefillin? Let's say they're passed down as a family heirloom, which is definitely something you'd want to hold on to just from the family value of it. But he asked, can they be discarded so that they cannot be thrown away? And when we're actually dealing with certain objects that were there to hold a sacred scroll, they could be double wrapped and thrown away, but the scroll itself cannot. So we can never discard that. If we wanted to discard it, it would have to be put into shemos, which means sacred items that are eventually going to be buried. So it would have to be buried if you wanted to get rid of it. But I would keep it for the sentimental value. But you can't throw it away. I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. You cannot throw it away. It's got to be buried.
Are there any other questions? Now's a good time. If you want to write in the chat box. I want to share something else, which is, so we have a website in Rochester I made a few years ago. And this is let's see, just load up from the beginning. The Merzel family sponsored a Rochester Mezuzah campaign. If you go to rochestermezuzah.com, it links to the site, Rochester Mezuzah.
Wow, I never knew about this. This is great.
And yeah, so now that we have a local sefer, I think Rabbi Chastain will be checking a lot of the mezuzahs. But our sponsor will give, you don't have a kosher, if you don't have any mezuzahs, you can get your first one for free. Even if you have and you'd like to get some more, you're going to purchase. There's a special now we have, which is for this month. The first mezuzah will only be $26. A kosher mezuzah in a beautiful case. And the other,
that's a very good price.
Yeah, it's a special now for, so if you don't have one at all, you can get one for free. If you have already, you want to get an extra one to add another doorway, then you can buy one for $26 and we'll apply this manually. If you want to get a second and third, the cost price is $43. That's what so for a good kosher mezuzah, as Rabbi Chastain mentioned before, there's many issues that can crop up, and a lot of times you can get a cheaper mezuzah in a Judaica store.
Yeah, it's not going to be good.
And he can tell you himself that he's checked a lot of these.
Yeah, don't go cheap on it. It's not the way. Yeah, I've checked plenty of these small little itsy bitsy ones, and they oftentimes are riddled with issues. Like I just saw on that website that you had pulled up, the $26 one is definitely being subsidized. So that's a big mitzvah, whoever's helping people get those mezuzahs. And it said the normal price for a base level kosher mezuzah is $43 on that site. And then you can really, a very nice mehudar, a very beautiful, well-written mezuzah is usually going to be somewhere more $75 to $90. But what the rabbi is selling there for $43 is definitely a kosher fine mezuzah. That's a good average price for a kosher mezuzah.
And that's so, and as far as also checking, if you go there on the website, you can bring it to Rabbi Chastain directly. He can put his address down if you want to go directly to him. You can do it in the chat box or your number.
Here we go. I'm putting it right here. Here's my cell.
Your cell and that, or if you'd like, you can put it on that website. You can do a check, and I will either get it from you, or you can drop it off at Chabad of Pittsford or the Kessler Family Chabad Center, and we can do that. Or you can go directly to our source, which for checking is going to be Rabbi Chastain, and it usually costs about $10 a scroll. He painstakingly goes through it and checks every letter, and if there's even a problem, I was very impressed. He will go letter by letter. He'll go line by line, showing you what the issues might have been.
Right, and if it is fixable, I'll fix it. Like I said, oftentimes with a mezuzah, if it has an issue, it will not be fixable and needs to be replaced. But if it is a fixable issue, I can fix it.
So highly recommended. The main thing is, as we get ready for Rosh Hashanah, we should, we're all doing the best we can. And this is a beautiful, easy way. We just take care of a mitzvah that connects your home, protects your home, and everybody in it. And it's, as it says, it's brought down. Elul is a special time. It's a special minhag to check your mezuzahs. I want to just add an interesting insight I heard about the concept of why we have mezuzahs on every single door, right? Many people think it's on the front door, but really it's in every bedroom door or any room door, besides bathrooms or smaller closets. So one of the reasons is that every room in your house, first of all, in olden days, there was like only one room in a house. That's why you find in Jewish law, it will refer to an individual house as an individual room as a bias, because it was interchangeable. A house was a room. Thank God we all live, kingly today relative to back then. So we have many, many rooms in our house. But an interesting concept is that every room has a different function. You have the dining room, which is for eating. You have the bedroom, which is for sleeping. You have the living room, which is for, lounging or living. Every single room is a different concept. And that's that's the idea in life. Life is different fragments of, functions. You have your eating, you have your eating, you have your sleeping, you have your parlor room. The idea of the mezuzah, we know, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. It's about bringing the oneness. The Rambam writes that when a Jew goes into a room and they see the mezuzah, it always reminds them that Hashem is watching, it'll inspire us to live a life in that room in a very godly way. Since every room is pretty much a different function, an individual person's bedroom, an individual for eating. So the point is that it brings a certain harmony. It brings all the different components of life into one. I thought it was a very conceptual idea of why it's so important to have a mezuzah in every room. So that's pretty much it.
That was beautiful, Rabbi. That's a beautiful idea.
So I want to wish you all a ksiva v'chasima tova,
Amen.
a sweet, be written and inscribed for a sweet new year.
Amen. You too,
Thank
Rabbi.
you so much, Rabbi Chastain, for taking time off your very busy schedule, coming here to inspire us and educate us, because knowledge is power, and that is how we will get ready for a wonderful, fortified year.
Amen. It was my pleasure, Rabbi. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, everybody. And you can go to the website, or you can contact Rabbi Chastain to check your mezuzahs. Have a wonderful night, and Shana Tova.
Amen. Have a good night, everyone.
Yashikov, rabbis.
One more thing, there was a request to mention that Tehillim for Rebbitzin Clinic is led by Rabbi Avi on Wednesday tonight, 8:15 p.m. I will post the link on the chat for everybody to see.
Okay.
Finish it real quick. Here's the Zoom link, or you can call.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Copy.
Thank you.
10 seconds, copy and paste. If you want to take it, because this when the Zoom is off, I don't think I'll access the chat box.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.